and dear start of the new year, and that is our colleague Ramy Aly, whom some of you might know from the Norris Summer School last year, where we were introduced to his work, especially through the contacts with Layal and Jamaria. And we started a discussion which we are very happy to continue here today. Every Doing Gender lecture is prepared by you yourself, so it's also a practice for you to get engaged with the work of international scholars, to ask the questions you have, and you will have ample opportunity to do that also in the masterclass for those who have inscribed them this afternoon. Layal will now introduce Ramy in a proper way to you, but I want you to join me in a warm applause to welcome Ramy to the program.
Hello, good morning everyone, and thanks for those who come from afar today on a Monday morning to attend this first Doing Gender lecture. I'm very excited to be introducing Ramy Aly today. Ramy is an assistant professor in anthropology at the American University of Cairo. Before coming to AUC, he taught anthropology at the University of Sussex, where he received his PhD in social anthropology in 2011. Ramy's research interests and publications engage with the anthropology of ethnicity, migration and diaspora, anthropology and media studies, militarism, cultural studies and youth cultures. He is the author of Becoming Arab in London, Performativity and the Undoing of Identity, published by Pluto Press in 2015. And this is the first ethnographic account of how gender, race, and class practices among British born and raised Arabs in London. Ramy also holds a BA in law with American Studies from the University of Sussex and an MA in Middle East politics from the University of Exeter, as well as an MSc in Comparative and Cross-Cultural Research Methods from the University of Sussex as well. He is a member of the Royal Anthropological Institute and the European Association of Social Anthropologists. But first and foremost, Ramy is also a dear friend and a fellow collaborator in the Arab Cultural Studies group that we established back in 2012 in London, but which eventually grew to include a transnational family of researchers and academics interested in the study of contemporary Arab cultures and committed to the epistemological project of Arab cultural studies. Some of the questions that guided our research pertain to the place of Arab subcultures and youth formations and the culture of protest that took over the region since 2011. We recognized then that the hegemonic cultural repertoire, be it that of Pan-Arabists, the Islamists, or the state-sponsored, were insufficient to make sense of the emergence of these subcultures and their practices. Of course, apart from that, thinking with and through the notion of translation, cultural, epistemological, and aesthetic that imbue the process of thinking, researching, and writing about Arab cultures at home and the diaspora also preoccupied our project. Today, Ramy will further reflect on that, building from his book, Becoming Arab in London, Performativity and the Undoing of Identity. He will address the epistemological challenges of researching gender, race, and class through sabotaging or cannibalizing disciplinary boundaries between queer theory and critical race studies. So the floor is all yours. Nice to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to Layal. I'm very grateful to Layal and Maria, particularly for making this happen. I'm very happy to be here, and this is a rare opportunity to think. I mean, in today's academic life, you don't actually get that much time to think, so I'm very, very grateful. So I've got a lot of stuff I want to tell you, so I'm just going to get started straight away. There are two main things that are going to structure this. The first one is a question, am I doing queer theory? And the second one is about cannibalism and epistemological unruliness. And I'm going to think about how theory is about dismemberment and then dismembered parts of ideas from different people, which then become orthodox wholes, and what are the consequences of those kinds of actions. So I'll start with, am I doing queer theory, and I'll leave it and come back to it, and right, you're just going to have to keep up with me. And I just want you to take note of these words, okay? So I didn't think that I was doing queer theory in 2008, when I was, just about to start writing up my PhD thesis. I thought I was very firmly within ethnic and migration studies, the study of race, and I was studying Arab migration to London, and multiculturalism and identity, and what does that have to do with queer theory? I mean, at that point, the answer for me was not much, really. I had a wealth of ethnographic information. I didn't have any commitments to any particular kind of theory when I started my field work. What I did have, actually, which is very important to this, was a kind of personal investment in the idea of being Arab, which by the end of the process was completely shattered. So, queer theory at the time, I wasn't really sure what to make of it. I just thought it was like a wacky new way of thinking about gender. And my supervisor told me that I should read Judith Butler, and I wasn't sure why. So I did it anyway, and a couple of months later, all the ethnographic material that I had collected had simply been reassembled in my head. It had a new meaning, but this is something, I suppose, that I'm trying to say about ethnographic practice, which is the complexity of everyday experience, its incoherence, its frustrations, the serendipity involved. All of that, for me, comes first before theory. So I don't go into anything wanting to forward a particular theory, but wanting to understand how a theory can partially help me to read very complex lived experience. Now, what happened when I realized that Judith Butler's work on gender performativity had something to say to my material, to the narratives of growing up in London, to the experience of being racialized, to the dynamics of multiculturalism and identity politics in Britain? What I came across were two obstacles from two different constituencies. Right? So I came across a kind of reaction within the anthropological literature to the discursive turn in critical theory, right? So lots of anthropologists were kind of like, yes, Judith Butler, that's all very nice, but it's not ethnographically grounded, and it doesn't take into account the reality of the body as we find it in ethnographic contexts around the world. This is like some postmodern disruptive gesture that might work in Euro-American literary theory, but is got nothing to do with everyday lived experience. So the message from a not inconsequential body of anthropologists was, don't do this, right? And then within the constituency of what had become, I'm going to call them, but I do this cautiously and with all due respect, the devotees of Butler, right? As in the people who think of themselves as Butlerians, there was also a kind of, no, don't do this. What I wanted to do was essentially say that as I look at young Arabs growing up in London, I see gender performativity as elaborated by Butler, but I also see racial and class performativity. And I came across literature which equally said to me, you can't do that. Right? Butler's performativity is about very specific configuration of ideas of identification and desire and mimesis and melancholia and cultural survival. And you can't take that from the context of homosexuality and heterosexuality and gender and then transplant it, if you like, to race and class. So as I encounter some of the early elaborations of queer theory, I am told that queer theory has a home and that I shouldn't take it away from that home. And I'm told that anthropology has a system of thinking about the body. Anthropology is still to this day very invested in the idea of humanism to some extent, and the idea that the body or acts are texts and discourses and stuff like that is not completely comfortable with anthropology. So I have two bodies of peers, if you like. Well, at the time they didn't seem like peers because I'm a small naive student and they're all people who are published and I'm reading them and they're telling me that I should be very careful about what I'm thinking. So the two things that I'm going to explore are about why is that the case? Why is it the case that you often come across this resistance to multidisciplinary thinking, to cross-pollination, to taking theory and cannibalizing it? So that's where I want to think about how theory is about dismemberment, but then becomes about orthodoxy. Why is that the case? And the second question is about am I doing queer theory and what is queer theory? And an attempt to maintain its genealogy as a set of ideas and a set of political practices, right? So the political activism around queer, but also queer theories, to recognize that, but to also invite myself and everybody else to breach it, right? To say, yes, see where it comes from, but also take it beyond where it started. Now, to the first question about how is it that theory is about dismemberment, but then becomes about orthodoxy, I think it's very interesting to think about how we come to personalize and individualize theory. Like we create theories and then we associate them with particular people, and then those theories become hard, if you like. From something supple that's created from many parts, it becomes hard. And so if we take Butler, who's my main inspiration at the time because of my very partial knowledge of queer theory, that's where I started. Butler's work is informed by Foucault. I've got a list here, and Lacan and Freud, and these are just the most obvious ones. So Foucault, Lacan, Freud, Derrida, Merleau-Ponty, de Beauvoir, Kristeva, Wittig, Austin, Nietzsche, Spivak, right? There's all of these people. That's what all together Butler uses to assemble gender performativity, right? As an idea, and ideas from each one. So we have philosophy and linguistics and psychoanalysis and psychiatry and all kinds of things coming together. Now, initially, I think it's important to consider the extent to which all of these people would have agreed with each other about anything in the first place. Right? So if we just took Freud and Lacan, you know, they disagree on many things. Principally the foundational myth, right, of like what is it that structures the ego's experience. And this is something that you should read about, but we don't have time to go into it now. But in short, Freud develops this idea of a foundational myth in Totem and Taboo, and Lacan has his mirror stage theory, right? And actually, while it appears like a little disagreement because Lacan is seen like as a psychoanalyst who follows from Freud, actually it's a fundamental disagreement. Right? Okay. Then we can think about Derrida and Foucault, and they are also not very comfortable partners. Right? They're so uncomfortable, in fact, that Derrida writes a whole book. Writing and difference is all like is a response to Foucault's particular formulation of what is philosophy and what is the aim of philosophy. Right? Foucault is very upset by what Derrida has to say about his philosophical assumptions that structure Foucault's discourse on madness. Right? So much so that Derrida writes a book, and then Foucault writes an appendix to the second edition of the History of Madness called A Reply to Derrida, right? And he accuses Derrida of, I think I have the quote here, he accuses him of being like a Christian on a mission to eradicate sin. Right? Okay? And again, this is not some small disagreement. This is a fundamental alternative set of readings of philosophy, right? And in particular, the work of Descartes and the idea of the process of doubt and all that business, right? Very complicated stuff. Derrida and Austin, right? Both in Butler's work. Couldn't be more different, right? Austin's speech act theory, but then Austin thinks that there are two forms of language. There's the different communicative acts are either felicitous or not, and then there's straightforward communication for him, and then there's this whole other category of language which he calls parasitic speech, which for him is everything from poetry to literature, right? All of this has got too many ways of interpreting, and therefore is not felicitous speech, right? And Derrida goes, that's rubbish, right? You can't tame language in this way. everything is theatrical, and of course Austin can't handle that, because if everything is theatrical, then life is theatrical, and suddenly the whole idea of felicitous communication is a farce. Now, all of these competing ways of looking at the world and philosophy and language suddenly come together, and like 10 years after gender trouble, become like Butlerianism, right? Now, how is this the case? I mean, and she is not doing that. She's very carefully choosing and showing that she is actually picking and choosing particular things, right, in order to make sense of the world. Now, I'm very interested in that because, as I said, I came across literature which told me, no, you can't cannibalize, right? So Butler might have cannibalized, and look, I've read her backwards as well, and this is how it works, but you can't do this. So what I see in this process of creating theory, in Butler's process of creating gender performativity, and my own much more humble and probably irrelevant way of doing something called ethnonormativity, I see a process of cannibalism. And I don't mean it metaphorically, I mean it almost literally. Okay? And I'm going to take you on a little journey, which some of you will be thinking in your heads, how typical an anthropologist telling us about cannibalism. I'm going to take you to the Brazilian Amazon, right? And I'm going to invite you to put your disgust and horror about the notion of anthropophagy, which is the human consumption of flesh, put it to one side and think about what it means rather than how yucky it is. Okay? And I'm doing that because I believe that it really can help to explain or provide an analogy with what we do with theory, okay? And also point some fingers back at us. Okay? Now, cannibalism, of course, is thought to be a very exotic practice, but actually it isn't. From the paleoanthropological record, there is evidence for cannibalism all over the world at various times, right? Even, well, I say even, but also in Europe, right? From the Upper Paleolithic all the way up to the Middle Ages, people have been debating whether the finds of bodies that they find or the rituals that are associated with particular burials represent cannibalism or not. So I would say that it's not so exotic, it's not as exotic as we think. It may look that way in the contemporary world. Now, I will not use a historical analogy of cannibalism. I will use it from the 20th century. Okay? In the 20th century in Brazil, in the northwestern Amazon, amongst the people called the Wari. Their practices have actually been outlawed by the Brazilian state, because of course they think they're outrageous and savage. But the work of an anthropologist called Beth Conklin gives us an insight into a particular kind of cannibalism. There are two types of cannibalism. One is called exo-cannibalism, which is where you eat your enemy, basically. It's nice and straightforward, eating the enemy, and this is the picture that in the Western imagination is very prominent. People being boiled in pots and all of that kind of stuff. But the more important one, or the more interesting one for me anyway, is her account of endo-cannibalism, which is the consumption of your fellow, as in your intimate loved one. Now, what I'd like you to do as I'm taking you through this is to imagine the body of the deceased, that I will be a theory, or the body of a theorist. Okay? Don't call, please. And I want you to think about these words, right? Dismemberment, relationality, sorry about my handwriting, reluctance, consumption, death, transformation, regeneration, and forgetting. Okay, so just keep these in mind as I walk you through this. Now, the thing is, for the Wari people, cannibalism is the most respected way to deal with the body. Right? It is not a form of negation of the other, quite the opposite. It's considered the most respectful way to treat a human body, especially of a loved one. The body here is at once a kind of locus of the physicality, if you like, of social relationships and social identities. But also the practice of cannibalism is very complex for them, in the sense that it is based on the idea of a reciprocity and equality between humans and non-humans. Okay? So in other words, for the Wari, you're not just a human. You are human and animal. And you may be a hunter one day, and another day you will be prey. Okay? So there's this idea of reciprocity. One day you are the consumer, and another day you will be consumed. Now, they have a very interesting set of myths around this, and what happens is they believe that once somebody dies, their body goes into the river, and from the river goes into the ground, into a nether world, right? So like into the world of the ancestors. So death for them is not a finality, it's like a transformation. You're transformed from being a human body into being an ancestor. And in the process of doing so, when the ancestors wish to visit, if you like, their living kin back in the living world, they can manifest themselves as two kinds of animals. One is a peccary, which is something a bit like a small pig, and the other is a fish. If while they are hunting the Wari, they find a peccary, they feel that this is a gift from one of their ancestors. Okay? Or in an analogous way, which I'll come to describe, one of their ancestors. So they are both human and peccary. If they are fishing and they find a fish, they believe that the fish is a gift of the ancestor of one of their allied tribes. Okay? So there's this very complex set of relationships where you're consuming peccaries, but also your ancestors. And your ancestors are human, but also pigs. And your tribal allies are with you in this earth, but can also manifest themselves as fish. Right? This is all in the work of Beth Conklin, which is absolutely amazing. So, just to remind you, right? Humans are not always humans. They're not always hunters, they can become prey. And death is not about death, it is not a finality, it is a transformation. Okay? You become an ancestor, and in becoming an ancestor, and when they go hunting and they find a peccary, then really it's almost like a gift from the ancestor to regenerate life. Now, sorry. What Conklin describes is that actually most of the rituals after the person has died are focused on the body itself, okay, the body of the person, and venerating in some form or another that body. However, at some point, that body is taken and is dismembered. And this is the point at which there is the most intense emotional dissonance for the people involved. The body is cut up into pieces, internal organs are removed, and everything that is edible is roasted. Right? And everything that is not is burnt. Even the bones are burnt and can be crushed into dust and still consumed. Right? Actually, what she reports when she does this ethnographic work is that people describe that the moment of dismemberment is far more traumatic for them than the moment of consumption. The moment of consumption is less traumatic. Now it's interesting, so now we have dismemberment, right? It's interesting who eats the body, right? The people who eat the body are not the immediate kin, not the people closest, so not your child, for example, will not eat the body, but your spouse's siblings, right? Or your child's in-laws. So there's all the proximate, they call them in anthropology consanguines, right? As in those people who you're related to through marriage. So the reason that the immediate kin don't eat the body of the deceased is that they believe it to be a form of auto-cannibalism. In fact, I'm just going to put this here because I think it's just as important. Right? Auto-cannibalism. So this is fatal for them. You should not be eating your absolutely immediate proximate loved one. Now, the eating is done with great reluctance. Okay? It's not about meat. It's not about, oh, here's a source of protein. Not at all. Right? This is a symbolic act It is done with much hesitation. The people who are charged with eating as a ritual kind of obligation do it with great respect, right? And they don't touch the flesh. They have to pick the flesh and consume it in a very kind of hesitant way, if you like. So, and when they're consuming, again, because it's not about flesh, it's not just about eating meat, it's the symbolism of that person being, if you like, consumed, ingested, becoming part of the idea of the cycle of life, right? This is what it's all about. So this is the point at which the human goes from being, a hunter to being prey, from being the eater to being eaten. Now, the reason we know that it's not about meat is because after the Brazilian state bans the practice of endocannibalism, the Wari still maintain the same attitude towards death, right? So they're no longer allowed to do it, but they maintain the same attitude. Now, what's interesting here is that from a Western perspective, eating is considered to be an act of objectification, of domination, dominating something, right? I eat you. You're my prey, I'll eat you. But in this context, eating is about respect and sympathy and incorporation. This desire for death not to be a finality, but for there to be a process of continuous reincorporation of individuals, even post-mortem. So the death of an individual is followed by their physical and their spiritual consumption, if you like. Now, what's interesting is I told you about the, when they catch peccaries, these small pig-like creatures, is that they don't look at the peccary and say, oh, that's my grandfather, or that's my mother or my father. It's just an ancestor, and this is very important, and I'll tell you why in a second. But when they do, again, the act of catching is followed by a very ritualized form of thanking, as in there's gift giving to the animal that's about to be consumed, there are libations and offerings that are made. Right? So, this takes us up to here. Okay? So, dismembered, who does it? Don't do it happily. They consume, and this is the body of a theorist for you, yes? Or theory. Then death, then transformation, human to non-human to ancestor, and this cycle where the ancestor appears to you as a peccary or a fish and thus gives you and your remaining kin life. Now, there's a double action that they have, and it's a really jarring contrast in the sense that, fine, after all of this has happened, they actually go about destroying any trace of that person as a social entity in their life. So their house is burnt down, all their physical possessions are burnt or given away, and they will even go to the places where that person used to fish or spend time. They'll slash the area from vegetation and burn it. Right? And actually what they're trying to do is to forget. Okay? So we're kind of here. Right? They're trying to forget this person. And the reason that they're trying to forget is that they believe that the person cannot make the transformation into being an ancestor without them really transferring from this world, really leaving this world, no longer being associated with this very personalized physical entity with material. We do the exact opposite. I carry my grandfather's wallet in my back pocket. Yeah? He died in 1982. So we do the opposite. We maintain the items of the deceased person. Whereas they say, no, we want this person to become an ancestor, to live in the netherworld, where actually they live a full life. They fish and they eat and they hunt and they sleep and they make love and they do everything, right? And in order for them to live in that world, they have to leave this world completely. Okay? And they have to become, if you like, ancestors without specific social identity to correlate to in this world. So, I am trying to say that this process of creating theory and creating orthodoxy mirrors this in one way or another. in the sense that in terms of relationality, as I've already said, we tend to personalize, even say that their reluctance to eat them, right, is because of this, that they feel it's like it's a form of, if I eat this person, then I'm eating myself. That's the end of me too, right? So it's left to proximate others in other disciplines, if you like me, yeah? So I'm not a literary critic or a philosopher. I see some ideas in Butler and I'm like, okay, I can run with this, right? But somebody else who's a relational proximate, yeah, and affin by blood, if you like, of Butler would say, hey, don't do that, right? You can't do that. Now, I also see that theory making is about dismemberment, you know, as we were talking about before. And that actually for those people who are the relational affines, as in the closest blood ties to the theorist, dismemberment is extremely distressing, right? So when you take a body of theory from somebody and you start picking and choosing from it, for them it is tantamount to this process of dismemberment of the body. Okay? And I find it very, very disturbing. Now, I think that this is the horror around dismemberment is the province of the theoretical devotee, the person who wants to be seen as a Foucauldian, a Butlerian, a Marxist, right? A Derridian, right? As in seeing those as identities rather than approaches, right? And there's a very big difference between the two. That once anthropology is turned into an identity rather than an approach, it's a disaster. Right? And once theory is turned into an identity rather than an approach, for me, it's also a disaster. Now, when it comes to a small student doing their MA or PhD, who then is inspired by some aspect of theory and wants to eat, yes, I want to eat this. I want to do a bit of cannibalism, right? Endocannibalism. It's not like I hate Butler or Foucault. I love them, right? I want to eat, but I have to eat them reluctantly because what I'm told is that eating them is about inconsistency. Sorry. And I guess the reluctance is also a very big question about theory and practice. For me, as an anthropologist, not as an identity, but a practitioner, as I was saying before, it's the complexity of everyday life that is more sacrosanct or compelling for me than theory. Theory is not my God. So, you know, everyday life is more. I can't imagine sustaining the idea that theory is more important than everyday practice. I can't imagine how that's the case. Theory is partial. It is created by people who are situated in places, who create it in relation to particular dynamics that they see in time and space. Some of those things have consistency across time and space, and some of them don't. But anyway, if you do eat, then you have to eat reluctantly, as they do with a stick, and with great care, right? You have to really be careful. Now, same with consumption. There's this sense that in cutting and mixing theory, you're doing something wrong. You're theoretically inconsistent. Right? Somehow you're denigrating theory. Right? Killing it, if you like. You're killing the theory. Why? Because you're consuming it, and you're consuming it, okay, fine, reluctantly, but you've dismembered it as well. Okay? And who are you to dismember it? Now, that's why, for me, theory sometimes looks like death. I mean, we had the sex is death thing. Right? Well, here, you know, theory looks like death to me because for, as a young scholar, it feels like theory is an end, not a means, right? It's like, oh, here it is. So theory is an end, and for the Wari, and for most people around the world, death is never an end. Death is about transformation. You become a spirit, you become a soul. There's an afterlife somewhere. But there's almost this, no, this is the end. This is Foucauldianism, and he got everything right, and we don't need to question his views on the Iranian Revolution or anything else, in fact, right? And Butler got everything right, we don't need to question anything about how it's an end, it's finished, right? Which is very interesting, because this is not how those theorists in and of themselves think about their own work, right? But this is how it is received. So, I would argue that for me, theory should be about these two things, transformation and regeneration. I know this is very simplistic, but what I'm trying to say is that if theory is useful to us at all, it should be about transformation and regeneration, the ability to live again and sustain life after the theory has been elaborated its first time, maybe after the corrections and the edits and the, all the stuff that follows from it, but even post-mortem. And I think that this is the only way in which we can really have respect for theory, is by thinking of its transformative and regenerative potential, right? Rather than its monolithic potential, rather than its individualized characteristics attached to a person. However, it is interesting, once we get here to forgetting, that we forget, right? I mean, what we do is we cite, yes? We're like, where did this idea come from? It came from, right? And if you think about it, all those people we listed for Butler, they are ancestors in a sense, right? There are people who, some of them were dead by the time she's writing Gender Trouble, or even before that when she's elaborating the idea of performativity. Many of them are dead, right? And what we do is we cite in order to say, hey, here they are. This is where this has come from. This is my theoretical genealogy. This is my theoretical ancestry. But we tend to forget about the cannibalism part, right? We tend to forget about the aspect of dismemberment, right? And consumption and rearrangement and transformance. So I'll let you think about that. And we can talk about that once I'm done with the rest of this. So, then we come to, am I doing queer theory? Well, I was first introduced to queer theory through Butler, but I didn't know it was queer theory. What can I say to you? It's just the way I'm not very clever. So I didn't have any sense that I was doing queer theory at all. But one of the reasons might be is that as you're working through her early work, there is no hard definition of queer, right? It's not like she starts off going, I'm going to define what queer is, and then it's going to stay the same throughout my work, and that's it. Quite the opposite. It's almost doesn't have a big role in Gender Trouble, not really. It has more of a role in Bodies That Matter, and so on. And she rarely used the notion of queer in relation to the notion of performativity, which is what I was interested in very much. Right? And I think that having read now retrospectively, is very interesting to think about. I mean, I read this amazing PhD thesis by this guy called Jacek Kornak, who's at Helsinki. It's called Queer as a Political Concept, 2015. Really great thesis. And he kind of charts the history of queer theory and has taught me that in the late 80s and early 1990s, actually most of the people deploying the notion of queer, yes, it's emerging from activism around HIV and AIDS and also around reassembling gay and all that kind of stuff, but they really suggest that queer is about a radical deconstructive gesture towards identity, per se, right? Or any form of normalization and normativity. And that's why I thought that I could take this and run with it, right? This, before reading the things telling me don't do this. However, interestingly today, so I was interested in how queer theory can help me explain race. Okay, just to bring you up to speed. How can it explain race? And today when you look for queer and race, what you find overwhelmingly is queer of color critique, right? Which is fantastic, but it also reflects something to me, which is that it reflects this relationality issue. As in, things can begin as very open, very radical, disruptive and deconstructive, and then in every discipline and for almost every concept, it can become funneled, right, into a specific area and cluster around it. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, or the queer of color debate is not relevant. Of course, it's extremely relevant. But the invitation here is that, for me, queer theory is about queer of color and is about gender and sexuality studies and is about gay and lesbian studies, but it also has a radical potential in it and beyond it, right? As a politics, right? And this is something that's very dear to me, having read about multiculturalism in Britain, for example, where black politics is not about your skin color at some stage, but becomes about your skin color as identity politics is deployed by the state, right? And it actually fragments the radical potential of black politics in Britain when suddenly you have to now be political in terms of whether you're South Asian, and then that's not enough. Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian, then that's not enough, right? There's like South Indian, North Indian, Muslim Indian, Sikh Indian, right? And so on and so forth. Are you black African or black Caribbean? Are you white other or North Africa? So this fracturing can be very, very divisive. And I'm not making any accusations about queer theory, please don't misinterpret me. I'm just saying that it is subject to the same processes of incorporation as any other radical idea. So I feel, to answer that question, in retrospect, I feel that I was doing queer theory without knowing it. And in a sense, I'm glad that I didn't know it, because I didn't necessarily have the baggage of having to navigate that disciplinary jargon and politics too carefully, right? Which I will, inevitably, you will ask me questions that will put me in that place. But for me, queer theory at that moment was about this disruptive gesture towards identity. Identity as an organizing principle. And for me, that the work that Judith Butler does to destabilize the notion of gender identity was very fitting for disrupting race identity. And I found this liberating because overwhelmingly when I was working in Britain at that time, there's almost an unchallenged acceptance of the notion of race and ethnicity as notions, right? So Butler is challenging the ontological status of gender. In the study of race and ethnicity and cultural identity in Britain, people are writing about race and ethnic groups. They're writing about racism, right? They're writing about the consequences of the thought without disrupting the thought, right? So they're writing about the consequences of the organizing principle of race, and rightfully so, but without disrupting the concept of race, right? Without interrogating it enough, in my opinion. So I felt that queer theory was offering me an ontological critique which was progressive, which constructivist accounts of race could never offer me, because constructivism is actually, it's useful, and we need to look at how things are constructed, fine, but it doesn't go the step further, usually, in disrupting the status of the organizing principle itself. It's quite realist. Constructivism is quite realist. In fact, some people, as I was working through the literature, were arguing that constructivism has this kind of cathartic love affair with identity and identity politics, because ultimately it is the fuel for its reproduction, right? So a lot of you are going to be very angry. And so for me, constructivism is very weak. And I don't think that saying, oh, something is socially constructed is enough of a radical move. That's like, I'm just going to say it and we can talk about it, that's just the obvious part, right? We know that everything is socially constructed, everything is instituted socially, so you can show me how it's instituted socially, but you have to, if you want to be radical, quote unquote, whatever that means, you have to disrupt it for me as a conceptual critique. And I was also very interested to think about that by the mid-2000s, as I was writing this, it was completely, it was increasingly accepted that you can say gender is performative, right? But you could not say that race, ethnicity, and culture, which I believe are all part of the same genealogy, at least in Britain, you can't say that they're performative. Saying that is somehow anti-progressive. But I believe there's a very clear slippage in race thinking in Britain, for example, and I'll keep my comments to the British context, where there's this denial of race. Oh, we don't do race anymore. We'll do away with the race relations paradigm, and that is immediately replaced with the same logic, but with a different term, ethnicity. And then that is done, and then it's not enough, so we do ethnicity and culture. And then ethnicity and culture are not enough, so we do race, ethnicity, culture, and identity, right? And all of them, for me, stand for this notion of incommensurability. These differences that we can never overcome, right? These authentic essences. And the thing is about working through queer theory is that if one thing is completely thrown out of the window, it's authenticity. Particularly through the work of people like Derrida, this whole idea of the authenticity of the sign, and then if you kind of translate that up to any other social process, authenticity is gone. So for me, I'm very suspicious of anything that claims to locate authenticity or to deploy authenticity. And again, lots of you will be very, very unhappy with me. And I don't think that there is any kind of solace or progress in pluralizing identities. So for me, the solution wasn't to just say, oh, there are many Arab identities. That for me, that's not going to cut it, because this is just pluralizing the organizing principle of identity, which purports to an essence. And in gender performativity, what we find is that it's not inside you, it's outside you, right? And it comes to write itself upon your body. So it's not an organizing principle from the inside, it's a process from the outside, and that's a very different one. I want to finish. How much time do I have? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay. So I worked my way through Butler, starting where she started, with Simone de Beauvoir. One is not born a woman, but becomes a woman. I just say, okay, I'm going to follow her process. I'm going to see where it takes me. I say one is not, there is a problematic, it's called Arab, in, of, and London, right? This is positioned as a social problem, a social issue. And I work through the process of trying to account ethnographically, which people accuse Butler of all kinds of things, but she's not an ethnographer, right? So they say, this is not ethnographically, but she's not an ethnographer, she's not an anthropologist, what do you want? So if I'm going to use her idea, if I'm going to consume and cannibalize and fine, then I try to ethnographically substantiate, if you like, the problematic, but also the process whereby identification is formed, that you live in a country, or actually it's not just the country. For identification, it's about everything from families to historical discourses, identifying you as the subject of an ethnic identity, in this case, Arab. You're born and then somebody tells you you are an Arab. Your parents tell you, the media tells you, the state asks you when you enter school or hospital, and so on and so forth. There are processes by which that you are encouraged to desire different ethnic identities, to desire whiteness, but also to desire ethnicity, right? To desire your Arabness, and those are very complex. There is this, these two then create a kind of compulsion to mime ethnicity and Arabness, and that miming is always partial, is never perfect, right? It's always going to upset your parents because you're not doing it properly. It's always going to upset, the countries from which you come because you're not embodying Arabness in the perfect way. And will upset the state when you say, I don't want to be seen as British, I want to be seen as English, right? So British is the category that saves Englishness from all of these colored people from, claiming it. So this compulsion is structured, and there are injunctions to do it. It is forceful, it is compelling, and actually my argument is that you have no choice but to identify ethnically in a context like Britain, and the failure to become those things is a melancholic kind of project of cultural survival. Now, what I will just finish with is that I think the most important thing that I get from queer theory of this early elaborative moment in the late 80s and 1990s is that you cannot think about heteronormativity without thinking about race and class. Okay? But what I wanted to do is, instead of just saying, oh, I'm doing gender, race, and class, I wanted to think of them in terms of normativities, in terms of the processes that institute them, right? Because when you, I'm not saying that saying gender, race, and class is wrong. I'm just saying that it kind of, you can easily forget that these are instituted processes. And so by having the suffix, if you like, normative, heteronormative, ethnonormative, and I can't think of a term for class, you think about the processes that institute those things. And I don't think that you can do one without the other. I don't think there's any point in thinking about heteronormativity by itself, or race without heteronormativity, or ethnonormativity without race and class. So I think it's really about, you know, some people call this intersectionality, so on and so forth. There are all kinds of ways in which you can conceptualize it, and I haven't figured out what's the right way to do it. But what I do know is that if you are looking to do something, I don't know how to put this, true to the deconstructive gesture, then you can't be doing one without the other. You have to do them all together. And they don't necessarily all become completely theoretically coherent. I found that the configuration of identification and desire and mimesis was slightly different from those in heteronormativity, but that didn't mean that they were radically unrelated, right? Or that I had to make them exactly the same. I felt that there was much more currency, if you like, in thinking about how they all come to act on people at the same time. I think that's it.
On the floor for clarification questions.
Okay.
And I guess there should be some clarification question. So do you have first any question about terms, concepts that were used and that you want to hear more about? Yeah?
When you were talking about color critique,
Yes.
can you maybe repeat or elaborate on what you said, that you thought that the critique is sort of already inherently within queer theory, but do you not see a relevance of the critique? Or?
No. I totally see the relevance of the critique. I was making a comment, there was an observation about the way in which there's this kind of clustering about things. So particular concepts will have disciplinary homes, and they're very productive within those disciplinary homes. But what I'm saying is you can also be productive beyond it as well. So it's not that I'm saying that it's not relevant, quite the opposite. I'm just saying that, for example, ethnography doesn't need to remain only in anthropology. There is an ethnographic turn in lots of other, as an approach, right? In lots of other disciplines. So for me, what's most interesting is when things travel across disciplines. Of course, what we see is that they do, but that we see more often clustering and remaining, if you like, remaining within particular areas, disciplinary.
I have a question about the idea of forgetting within theory, because another example of kind of spiritual cannibalism is the communion in the Catholic Church. Well, contrary to cannibalism, as you explained it, it's about remembering. So why do you think forgetting is so important? Or what do you understand as forgetting?
Well, I was using it mostly in relation to this particular, so this is not a universal, if you like, model for cannibalism. This is in a specific context, in the context of the Wari in Brazil, as described by Beth Conklin. And I'm not suggesting that any of these things are fixed. So that's great that there are other ways of forgetting, but I was using it as an analogy, if you like, for the way in which we don't forget, if you like, through citation, but that we might forget in a processual sense as to how we assemble theory. And that forgetting is most clear when we create these theoretical gods, if you like, that we then come to worship. So I'm not saying that there can't be other ways of thinking about forgetting.
Other clarification questions? Or any other question?
I'm really also interested in this concept of forgetting in terms of citations. Because I know when I was writing my bachelor's thesis, there was a lot of issues that I didn't use, kind of these like founding theorists, like Butler and Foucault as much. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on like for how long are we going to use citation to almost remember these people in a way, versus when have we dismembered them enough that we can move on and pass them?
That's a good question. Well, I don't know that the aim is to dismember them and move past them. I mean, the thing about the why analogy, it's just an analogy, okay? Part of the analogy is that they're not forgotten. It's not necessarily about forgetting those people completely. I mean, I can't imagine that in burning somebody's possessions, you actually forget them, right? You don't necessarily forget them. But for me, the forgetting is more about the installing of theory as a hard substance, if you see what I mean. Like, that's where I feel like when people accuse you of intellectual or theoretical inconsistency, I think that's where the forgetting happens, is that they're forgetting that it took dismemberment in the first place and this kind of cutting and mixing to produce this in the first place. And that's why I'm alluding to Butler. All of these people don't agree with each other about anything, but suddenly we have, retrospectively, we then create this thing that's consistent, perfectly seamless, which of course, the more we investigate its genealogy and the people behind it, we realize it's not consistent. It's full of disagreement and contestation and mixing and matching and choosing. So it's not that I'm suggesting that what we should do is reach a point where, oh, we don't have to cite anymore. I think citation is very useful, but it's the thing that distresses me the most is this kind of devoteeism, this idea of, the theorists and the theories as demigods. That's what I find. That requires a process of forgetting, in my opinion. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I don't think it's about finding that point where we no longer have to mention it. I mean, what I find most interesting is when you have a thought, and then you find somebody who's thought before you about it, and perhaps thought of it in a different way, and then it adds something to you. It's not about erasure at all, necessarily. But it can't then be all cut and mix, and then, suddenly you create this God for me, this theoretical God, and you tell me I'm inconsistent with it. So,
Can I expand?
yeah.
I guess maybe then a little bit more on, then like when I first was thinking about this, like the body has to run out at some point, like you cannot continue to keep using this, but maybe if it is dismembered and used in different ways, are we then expanding more upon those different ways than the original form?
Yeah, and
Okay.
so what? Yeah. Does it have to be consistent with the original form? In my opinion, no. Theory is partial. It's an idea in time that means something else in another. In fact, that's what the whole post-structuralist movement, particularly in Derrida, is that you cannot contain authorial intention of anything. You can't contain the meaning of anything. It will travel and have different meanings that you intend and that you don't intend, and that you like and that you don't like, and there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, I think it should be free to travel, if you like.
I was just wondering about your opinion on
the role that academic institutions play in creating the like divergentship of various different theories.
Yeah, I do have a bit of a problem with this, but I think it's I don't know, it's a very touchy subject, but for some people in anthropology, theory is more important than ethnography. And I think both are important, but both are partial. But there are programs where you are encouraged to, and there are programs and there are disciplines and sub-disciplines that tell you have to, before you do this research project, what's your theoretical framework? I mean, for me, doing anything that involves working with people in an ethnographic approach, that's a ridiculous question. Like to presuppose a theoretical ground that will guarantee and remain consistent as you enter the field, quote unquote, is very problematic. Theory can inform, but I don't think it should lead. So yeah, I think academic programs do have a part to play in it. Of course they do.
I heard you saying that queer theory has a disruptive gesture towards identity, and you also made like a criticism of social constructivism.
Yes.
And so how do you want to fill the gaps? I mean, do you have any suggestions?
Yes, I mean, and it's not me filling the gaps. It's people like Paul Gilroy who've been working on this for the best part of 30, 40 years. I mean, I was really inspired by somebody like Paul Gilroy, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but one of the most famous ones is The Black Atlantic. And he is one of the most important scholars on race in Britain. And in his more contemporary work, after doing lots of anti-racist work and lots of critical work around race, eventually he comes to the conclusion that any rights that are derived from identitarian politics, in a sense, are always doomed to sustain race and identity politics. So in a sense, and this is why I was saying to you that, I mean, for me personally, what happened is I go into this PhD project very invested in the idea of me being an Arab. But I come out realizing that that's how I have been made to see myself. And that it's only partially by choice, quote unquote. It's mostly about lots of other processes that are very, very discernible. And what disturbed me the most was the point at which the most radical act then is to affirm my Arabness. Which ultimately for me there's nothing radical about that, because it reduces me to an ethnic label and to an ethnic and racial imperative, an organizing principle around the world. So what I would say is there's plenty of literature to help you through that. It's not easy. In fact, it's very challenging because now one of the trends is to affirm one's identity. And it's understandable because of asymmetries of power and racism and all these things make it totally sensible, right? To be affirmative in terms of, to mark yourself as being black or being Arab or whatever it might be. But I think this is why I was interested in queer theory, is because it disrupted that process for me, which in the end appeared to be understandable but simplistic, or at least transient. You can do it if there's an immediate political end to it, but if you believe it for too long, and if you structure your world around it, you're just reproducing that thing which you claim to hate, which is racism.
Maybe, Ramy, I want to go on a little bit about this matter of identity politics and disagree with you.
Yeah.
And also following up on the question on queer of color critique. So I think what you meant when you talked about disciplinary homes is that queer of color critique just kind of creates a further niche within queer theory in order to feel even more at home in an even more shrink space, so to say, or more specific identity space. But if you look at queer of color critique as it came out as a theoretical project in Roderick Ferguson's work, for example, who's the first one who named queer of color critique. You have a trained sociologist actually doing disciplinary critique of sociology through literature, drawing together constructivism, queer theory, black feminism, and kind of calling for a transgression of all those boundaries in order to make sense of queer of color experience and queer of color as a critical intervention, right? And that same book, Aberrations in Black, even has an entire chapter which is a critique of identity. So I was, moving from that theoretical project, I would say, can we imagine a more, instead of this pro-identity politics against identity politics, a more dialectical relationship between identity and crossing of boundaries, or identity and coalition politics, for example. There might be a dialectical relationship that can, keep together and intention the affirmation of specificity and the opening that you are calling for.
Yes.
Instead of just moving against identity politics in order to make space for them, right? But they can operate together, so to say.
Yes.
That's what I would say.
Yes, and I completely agree with you. I'm not suggesting that it is not it is not progressive, or that it is not needed, or that it is not disrupting boundaries, the queer of color critique. That's not what I meant at all. What I meant was that it should also have resonance in debates about race beyond. That's all. And I can totally see it having that capacity and potential, and it does, but then I would say back to you, okay, fine, show me the extent to which it resonates beyond its disciplinary home, like as a weight, right, of scholarship. I'm not suggesting that the substance is any less radical and cut and mix and hybridized within its home, but I'm inviting myself and maybe everyone else to think about how it can breach it and also do the same thing beyond, particularly in relation to a construct like race and class as well.
Yeah, well, to that, I would also reply that it's interesting because if by disciplinary home you mean queer theory, actually most, or part of queer of color work in the United States, for example, came out of American studies. As a disruption of American studies, and making American studies post-nationalist. So, in a way, it didn't even come out of the disciplinary home of queer theory, which is also an interesting,
And as well, Butler comes out of literary criticism.
Absolutely.
So yes, no, I'm aware of all of this. I think what I'm not trying to do is point the finger at anybody at all. That's not the intention. The intention is to really recognize this radical potential and recognize as well how disruptive it has been and how productive that disruption has been, and to call for it to keep doing that. Yes.
Hey, thanks for your presentation. So I'm fairly new within this queer studies field, and so I'm just interested in hearing if you'd be open to sharing some of your more inspiring theorists in terms of, or in relation to this term cannibalism. If I could read a little bit more about this.
I don't have a ready bibliography at hand, but if today you're hearing about cannibalism and you're interested in it, there is a large literature on it, but you will find it almost exclusively within anthropology and almost exclusively about non-Western cultures. So yeah, off you go, man. You get that bibliography from me, and I'll be very happy to read it.
Oh, wait. Yep.
This is a question of my own curiosity. I also have an anthropology background, so I was wondering, have you also conducted ethnographic fieldwork concerning the performance of ethnic or racial identities? And maybe elaborate on that?
Have I conducted fieldwork on?
You were talking about the performance of ethnic and racial identities.
Yes.
Have you conducted ethnographic fieldwork on this?
Yes, I managed to write a book about it. So yes, and I did it specifically on British-born and raised Arabs in London. So I'm working on some more stuff, but that's the most detailed account that I have at the moment. It's about how performativity works in terms of ethno, hetero, and class normativity amongst British-born and raised Arabs in London.
But how did you specifically research it? What challenges did it bring with it?
It brought mostly conceptual challenges. As I was saying, because I was mostly led to believe, and again, this is what I'm trying to say, is that I was led to believe, hey, you're doing ethnic and migration studies, right? And there's a literature within ethnic and migration studies which doesn't so much, or if you like, the anthropology of race and ethnicity and culture in Britain. It kind of like funnels you into a particular direction and into a particular literature. So the challenges for me were mostly conceptual in the sense that I had to think and then unthink the terms of reference by which I would come to understand this. But I think the main challenge for me personally was that collecting the kind of rite of passage of doing ethnographic fieldwork is difficult in and of itself. When you're doing fieldwork for the first time, or you're thinking or doing ethnography, you're trying to write field notes and interview people and go places and participate and all that kind of, that's challenging in and of itself. But then making sense of it is much more challenging, and it's more challenging to do it in a way that's disruptive of your disciplinary norms. And that's really where I found the most potential, is to not take the bait. Okay, fine, I started off with and I cover this in the introductions, that, oh my God, how boring. I'm doing Arabs in London, just like somebody else did, I don't know, Moroccans in Paris or Turks in Berlin, as if somehow that's supposed to mean something concrete, right? So it's really at the level of concept, and then how those concepts can help you read and understand very complex experiences. So yeah, I have some work on this. Read it, let me know.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
You tend to use sort of the theory of performativity from queer theory in thinking about race.
Yes.
And you emphasize a lot this notion of the deconstructive gesture around thinking race.
Yes.
Right? But I mean, there's a lot that's been written, particularly from cultural studies in the UK, around this, the importance of thinking race beyond black cultural politics, and to thinking about new ethnicities as a response to the 80s and 90s multicultural boom in the UK, and particularly thinking about the identity formations around race, which is one about constant identification and disidentification with norms that are racializing, that are gendering, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me the emphasis on this deconstructive gesture almost erases the everyday aspect of identity formation, which is one about constant identification and disidentification. So I was wondering, how do you actually work with this contradiction? And it goes back to this notion of the dialectical, which you have.
Yeah, but I think that's why this idea of melancholia was so interesting for me. And actually I completely agree with you, that in the everyday, you are constantly reminded, and you must embody those things and constantly like do it and then undo it, and if you like, perform to different demands. So what I ended up trying to say is, I found as well this very contentious debate in anthropology and in other places on what is performance. Like in anthropology, there's large literature on performance. And what is performativity, and what's the difference between the two. So what I'm trying to say is that I try to do something processual and everyday, which exposes these everyday realities, does not negate them at all, but frames them ultimately within a context where, you're right, it is about identification and disidentification, and that's why the notion of melancholia and cultural survival meant so much, in a sense, is that you're having to do these things, it's not coherent, and it is real, and you do live in a context that racializes you, and you do have aspects and experiences that you know, pull you in different directions in terms of racial and ethnic desire and performance. So you're right to say that it was just a choice to if you like, to frame it and narrate it in a particular way, but not a negation of that at all. But I do, having said that, I do think ultimately